issues that are kind of happening right now in quantitative biology or are resurging in new ways. One thing that's been arising in recent years is, of course, electronic medical records. And the issues that go along with those, their usage, their standardization, and things like this. So what we try and do in these topics is give a wide view, and particularly try and give views that maybe we don't get when we're in the lab doing our research. And so we have a variety of panelists today, and we've changed the order slightly. So first, we're going to have Dr. Adler-Milstein, who's from public health, talk about kind of a broader, bigger picture view of this. We'll then have Dr. Huela talk about the regulatory issues. And then we'll have Dr. Hanauer talk more about the research and technical issues that he deals with his research. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. Adler-Milstein. Dr. Adler-Milstein is an associate professor in the School of Information and the School of Public Health. And as I understand it, you've worked with congressional groups for this kind of work, right? Yeah. All right, so let me just bring up her talk.
I got a promotion. I'm an assistant professor, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, listen.
Well,
I know,
yeah,
thank you so much. You can let the provost know. That was good. Yeah, you put it away. Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm so happy to be here today, and my voice is, I just came off of 3 hours of teaching, so I think my voice will hold out for another 10 or 15 minutes. But this is, as your introduction alluded to, this has been an area of incredible change, and the pace is, I think, almost breathtaking. And it's been a really interesting set of issues to study for someone whose background is really in health policy. That's what sort of my degree is in. That's what my passion is, and have sort of gotten sucked into electronic health records and health IT because it's been one of the areas in which we've had the most active policy efforts over the past few years. So I'm going to just try to set the stage. We thought it made sense for me to go first to sort of give you some big picture sense of what's been happening across the nation, and then dive into some of the more specific issues. So that's what I want to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes doing. So as I said, I'll just sort of do very brief policy context. I'm going to talk about this really transformative piece of legislation in the world of electronic health records, and then just try to give you a brief sense of where we've ended up now, about 7 years after the passage of that legislation. So I'm going to give a report card on sort of what's transpired since this was passed. So why electronic health records? I mean, I almost don't think we need to have this discussion anymore, but it is, I think, a helpful starting point. And it really came from the recognition that sort of almost anything that we were trying to do in the healthcare system, and even including sort of public health and research, was just not feasible in a world in which health information was stored in paper-based medical records. If you want to do sort of any information management task, and I showed you that room and said, have fun, you would say, I think I'm going to pick a new job. And so it just, I think, became really clear that this was not a sustainable path forward for the U.S. healthcare system. And so, really key domains such as just being sure that information can follow patients across care delivery settings to ensure that they're getting safe and effective care, right? You just can't do that effectively or efficiently in a paper-based world. So I think there were sort of so many reasons that were really pointing to the need to help the healthcare industry catch up to other major industries, all of which had computerized, in the 80s and 90s. In the sense that like healthcare had to be next. And so I think there was just sort of not really a policy debate about whether or not we should do this. The question was really how. What's the sort of right tool, and in particular sort of should we use policy as something to drive electronic health record adoption in the healthcare system. So the first question, as we started to sort of recognize the importance of moving towards electronic health records was, well, where does the country stand? What are adoption rates today? And so I'm showing you here the data that was available that sort of tracked where the country stood with electronic health records. And this is data from sort of US physicians. And what we realized in sort of the early days was that, adoption rates looked pretty low, right? I mean, it was not, we were nowhere even near the halfway mark. But also that this data was coming from surveys of physicians who were asked, do you have an electronic health record or not? And the question was, when someone says yes, do they even know what they're saying yes to, right? And they could have very different definitions in their head of what it meant to have an electronic health record. So pretty quickly it became clear that we needed to collect better data to really have a picture of where the country stood. And the first step with that was sort of defining what is an electronic health record. And the approach that was taken was to basically define a set of electronic functionalities and say, if you have these electronic functionalities in your practice or in your hospital, then you at least have a basic electronic health record. And then sort of this more comprehensive list of functionalities was considered a comprehensive record. So what you can see is these are things just, do you have electronic patient demographics recorded? Do you have problem lists, medication lists? Can you order medications electronically? So functions that you would not expect a lot of variation. If I asked a physician, do you enter your prescriptions electronically or not? There's not a lot of sort of user bias that's likely to enter into whether they say yes or no. So this essentially became the national standard for how to think about, do physicians and hospitals have electronic health systems using these definitions of basic and comprehensive. And then when we went back to the data, and for the first time, as you can see in 2006, we asked those more detailed questions, and the rates dropped off pretty substantially, right? So what you saw is that there was a lot of difference in what people were thinking constituted an electronic health record. And when we said what % of US physicians have a comprehensive health record, we were at 3%, right? And so this was pretty staggering to think like, in midway through the 2000s, these rates were really low. And I will tell you on the hospital side, they were even lower. So it really created then, I think, this sense of urgency that we need to do something, right? These rates are low and they don't appear to be going up very quickly. And so it's really a case that seems like a policy intervention is needed. I'm flexible. Maybe I should, is it going to count against my 10 or 15 minutes?
Oh, it would. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this, but at the end of the 3 presentations, we're actually going to have a panel for all questions to be asked. So
yeah, I'd say if there's quick clarifying questions. Yeah. Yeah. So what it was, the survey sort of agnostic to like who the vendor was, and it was just really about, do you have this functionality in your practice, yes or no? And so that could be 4 different systems that when pieced together gave you all those functions or not. It was actually one of the criticisms of that definition was that it doesn't tell you how well integrated those functions are or not. But it, the sense was when they're that low, we shouldn't even, be that critical about what's going on. So these same surveys then asked about barriers, right? So if you haven't adopted, what are the key challenges? And again, this sort of national data made it clear that there were a few set of really high priority issues. And the biggest was sort of money, the sense that both these systems are expensive and I don't have the capital to invest in them, as well as uncertain return on investment. If I invest in one of these systems, am I going to benefit, or are these benefits going to accrue to patients, payers, sort of other third parties? There was also a set of issues around how do I pick a system that is going to meet my needs, that a vendor that's still going to be around a year or 2 from now, as well as you can see some concern about, do I have the capacity to implement? Do I know how to go through this very disruptive change? And what's going to be the impact on my productivity? So a range of barriers to address, but I think it was pretty clear from the start that we had to start with addressing the financial barriers. These questions were also asked in terms of what facilitators, what would encourage you to adopt electronic health records, and then the data was very consistent, right? It was monetary incentives for purchase or some kind of additional payment. So I think the signal to policymakers was quite clear that if you want the country to increase adoption of electronic health records, there needs to be some kind of financial incentive type intervention. So this sort of all culminated in the passage of the HITECH Act. This was part of ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which if you'll recall was all about sort of shovel-ready projects. How can we stimulate the US economy with things that were sort of ready to go today? And this was just, I think, a relatively non-controversial part of a part of ARA, which was to say, if we think electronic health records in healthcare are good, and the data is pretty clear that we need to stimulate their adoption using financial incentives. And so this sort of opportunity for ARA just, I think, created the perfect forum to specifically target financial incentives for electronic health records. So this sort of shows you all the pieces that were in HITECH, but really at the center of it was this idea of meaningful use of electronic health records. From a policy perspective, what they didn't want to do was give doctors a lot of money to have computers and unopened boxes on their desks. And so the question was, how do we give doctors money to not just adopt these systems, but use them in ways that we think will really improve care, right? Those are the outcomes that we ultimately cared about. So the policy challenge was sort of how do we give them money for something that will ensure that they're actually doing what we care about and what we think is valuable. So that was sort of the core policy challenge of high tech, was how to do that. How do you structure this policy intervention in that way? And then there was sort of, again, a much longer talk. You talk about all these other pieces that went into it, but that was really, the heart of it. But they also wanted to be sure that, for example, health information exchange could happen, that the systems could share information with each other, as well as make sure that there was some sort of support for physicians who were going through this adoption process. So they set up at the very top box there something called regional extension centers. These are essentially geek squads for doctors who can go to their offices and help them adopt. So they tried to, I think, really approach this in a comprehensive way that addressed the various barriers. So just sort of a little bit more detail on this meaningful use piece. So again, as I said, these are financial incentives, and they are structured. They flow through Medicare and Medicaid, so they're extra payments that doctors get from Medicare and Medicaid. And there was a lot of sort of design decisions and the factors that went into the specifics of the regulations. But in short, if you are a provider who sees a lot of Medicare patients, you can get up to $44,000 for adopting an electronic health record system and meeting these meaningful use criteria. And if on the Medicaid side, they were a little more generous because they were concerned that Medicaid providers may need a little bit more money and help in order to keep up. And they did not want to sort of have these policies result in some kind of digital divide where Medicaid providers got left behind. They sort of did this trick where they front-loaded the incentive. So the earlier you started the program, the more money you got. And then for the Medicare side, it actually converts to penalties. And so last year was the first year that providers that did not participate in this program actually got paid less because of it. So it's often described as a carrot and stick program. So they got some of the money, some upside incentives, and then it converted to penalties. And as far as we know, for the near future, that will continue. So just what are these meaningful use criteria? Just to give you a sense, I mean, they are very specific about how you have to use electronic health records to sort of capture data and manage care. So these are things like you have to submit 30% of your prescriptions electronically, and you have to capture, basic patient demographics in a structured format. So you can go and find the specific criteria that basically say how electronic health records have to be used, and then providers attest that they did that, and then they get these incentive payments. And it's, I think, if we step back, it's sort of a really remarkable program, right? It's hard to think about other policy efforts that have come into an industry and really dictated how to use technology to do their job, right? Most other industries adopted technology on their own and has had a much lighter sort of regulatory framework around it. So it's really, in some ways, I think, a one-of-a-kind program in terms of how precise this was in terms of how to use technology to support healthcare delivery. The other sort of interesting thing in the program was that there are these stages that roll out over time. It actually was in the original legislation from Congress that said you put in these criteria and they have to get progressively harder over time, so that, and I think they may have said progressively more valuable over time, which also means progressively harder. And so what we're seeing is that every few years a new stage of the program comes out that asks doctors and hospitals to use electronic health records in more advanced ways. And so that's been, I think, both a good thing in the sense that you do want to make the criteria more valuable over time. But there's also, I think, been a lot of frustration with how fast they're moving and whether they're actually getting the criteria right at all. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the problem is that change of mind is corresponding with when the incentives are converting to penalties. And I think it's actually making it tricky to detect whether this is truly not valuable or whether just now that there's no free dollars. And so, I mean, I personally agree. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I mean, again, this is a much longer than a 15-minute discussion, but there's been, I think, a lot of pushback given how sort of top-down and specific this program has been, and really sort of dictating to providers, like, this is how you have to use systems to manage care. Okay. So again, I think, thinking about this as like, what was the policy challenge in getting this right? It really had to do with sort of what level of incentives and how to define these criteria in ways that were going to be valuable. And we didn't really have a lot of, guidance to know how to get this right. And so I really think this was an area in which policymakers had to take a guess at how much to pay providers and how to structure these criteria. And again, I think they probably got some of it right, but not all of it. So let me just spend a minute on that piece. So I think the first question is, so did it drive adoption? Have we seen an increase in electronic health record adoption since the Meaningful Use program came online? So I'm going to start with hospital data. So in 2008, which was the first year we had really good data, we saw that 9% of hospitals had at least a basic electronic health record, and it was sort of creeping up each year. The incentives start, and it's almost been, sort of a classic hockey stick. Huge increase in hospital EHR adoption. In the most recent numbers, 3/4 of hospitals had at least a basic system, and those that didn't were very close, right? They were usually just missing one or two of those functionalities. It's been a little bit less of a success story on the sort of outpatient physician side. You can see they started a little bit higher. Again, we're sort of creeping up a little bit year over year. The incentives start. And again, just have not seen that same hockey stick growth. It's been a lot more sluggish. And I think the sense is that, small physician practices have really had a harder time sort of keeping up with the program, as well as just adopting electronic health records to begin with. Okay, so now this is my last slide, which is sort of a high-tech report card, where I just want to sort of preview some of both what's gone well as some of the challenges. So I just showed you data on adoption of EHRs. If we're going to say sort of one thing has worked well with these policies, I think it's that. On the hospital side, I give them an A. I mean, I really think that we've seen a big increase in adoption of electronic health records. There's some question of whether that would have happened anyway had there not been incentives. So sort of what's the counterfactual? And I actually think we have a pretty good counterfactual in the sense that there were hospitals that were not eligible for meaningful use incentive payments, and they really have not adopted. And so I'm actually convinced that if we're going to give high tech an A on anything, it's really driving adoption among hospitals. And again, I think now there's some questioning about whether it's worth sticking with the program, but there was over the last 5 years, I think it's really driven a lot of adoption. I give them a B+ on physician adoption. As I said, I think we didn't quite get the program right to convince the majority of physicians to adopt, but we're over 50%, and I think we're really going to have to hope that from here on out that there's going to be there's not going to be more incentive payments, but that there are going to be sort of other forces, health reform, et cetera, that help pick up the physicians that haven't yet adopted. Almost everything else. Ooh, sorry, this is not. I'm just going to go back and talk through these so my red doesn't get in the way. I have to say that the rest of the report card is going to start to get pretty depressing. I think. Oh, absolutely. So I will just say that I think sort of almost everything else we really have struggled with. This includes things like getting physicians, like long-term care providers, sort of all of the providers who were not part of the financial incentives to be sure that they're keeping up. I feel like we built great highways and then we didn't pave any of the roads off the highways. And so you can get great hospital care now and then you transition to a long-term care facility and it's just, very, going back 10 years into the dark ages. I think we have not done a great job of engaging patients to interact with their data. I think we have really not done a good job of interoperability, moving data around the healthcare system between different provider organizations. Usability, David is an expert in this. I'm not sure he's going to talk about it, but I think these providers hate these systems by and large, and they are not what we would consider to be very usable. And I think there's some real questions about data quality. So we have a lot more electronic data that's now captured in these systems, but particularly for folks like you who might want to access and use that data for research and other purposes, I think there's real questions about whether it's good data that's actually going to tell us something meaningful. So I think, lo and behold, we've come a long way, but we are nowhere near the peak or the end of this story. Go on.
So next we're going to have Dr. Julia, who holds a JD, and I believe that Juris Doctorates. I'll use the honorary there. She is the Director for Regulatory Compliance in the medical school, and she's going to talk to us about the related issues there.
in the hospital. You may just complain in the hospital.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is this on? I can't tell. Okay. Yeah, these aren't my slides.
That's hard.
But while we're waiting for my slides to come up, I'm here to talk about the use of electronic records and provide a legal and an ethical perspective for you to contemplate as we think about how we can use some of these data. So first of all, large data sets are very important to research, and they're driven by a lot of the meaningful use efforts that have been going on in the collection of these large data sets in our electronic medical records. The important thing to think about, though, is what are the risks to the individuals who are the subjects of this data? And we have to think about that because it's a very important concept. So we're concerned about basically three things. We're concerned about harm to the individuals, perhaps maybe someone being able to re-identify the information, or perhaps maybe there's direct identifiers in these databases that can identify who they are and perhaps cause them any kind of harm, like perhaps financial harm. Identity theft is quite a big industry right now. And so being able to identify patients and use their identity to use their medical record for something, perhaps maybe purchasing pills, OxyContin is an example. That's a pretty big market for OxyContin. So there's a lot of impetus for us to try and keep the data private as much as we can. There's also the reputational harm for the institution as well as the individual. And I will say that medical records out on the market today run about $50 to $90 a record, far exceeding a credit card record. So this is a hot commodity right now, and we need to do everything that we can to protect it. And also, because medical records have a longer shelf life today than a credit card does, there's a lot of institutional processes that are in place in the commercial world that will alert us right away when someone's using our cards erroneously, but not so much if a medical record is being used. That takes a little bit more time. So there's more opportunities. So what I wanted to do is set a baseline of health law. So health information privacy is federal law, and what it is called HIPAA. How many are familiar with what HIPAA is and what it does? Marvelous. I've saw nearly every hand go up, and that's wonderful. We'll get into a little bit of detail, though, just to refresh your memories. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued privacy rules to implement requirements that were part of the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, which is HIPAA. And those rules establish standards of privacy of individually identifiable health information. Privacy standards also talked about when we can use information and how further we can disclose that information. And specifically, the information we're talking about is what's identifiable, which has a name of protected health information. And that would be something that could identify us directly, our name, social security number, a medical record number, but also indirectly, which a lot of us don't really think about. But indirect could be our a treatment date or something like that. That's within the data elements considered by HIPAA to be regulated as protected health information. The privacy rule also establishes conditions under which, I'll hit that point. But the last point here I wanted to stress, and then what's in goals for us, is that the privacy rule really tries to balance patients' privacy rights with the need to use this information for other purposes. And one of those major purposes here in the academic world at the University of Michigan is for research and also for clinical quality improvement. We need to have this information so that we can conduct our research and also do our clinical quality work, which is really related to how the hospital can improve its delivery of care systems. What is protected under HIPAA? Individually identified information. And let's go over the definition of what that means. That means that it's any information that's collected in the course of treatment, billing, or operations that a covered entity would collect. The University of Michigan Hospital System is a covered entity by definition under HIPAA. And it's about an individual's past, present, future, physical or mental health or condition information, the provision of health care to the individual. So when we provide that care and we collect that information, it goes into our electronic medical record. It is protected health information to the extent that it is identifiable. There's other, this is more into the research realm, there's other laws that help protect the privacy and the preventing harm to study subjects, and that's the common rule. It's a federal program, federal policy as well. And the common rule establishes standards of ethics for government-funded research, and that is primarily if it is government-funded research, so not if it's something that's privately sponsored. But we do try to apply the common rule commonly across our different research applications here at the institution, because it becomes too difficult to try to say, oh, well, this is government-funded, therefore it falls under these rules, versus this being a privately sponsored initiative. But the requirements for assuming compliance, what it provides is requirements for assuming compliance for research institutions. It provides requirements for researchers obtaining and documenting informed consent, which is very important when we're conducting our research, as well as authorization to use protected health information, which are two separate things. Requirements for institutional review boards, how do they staff them, who's the members, and really basically what their processes of the reviews are. So it provides all of the guidance that we need for those applications. And also, this is an interesting thing I think it'd be important to know, is that the notice of proposed rulemaking went into effect to take a look at this regulation. And it hasn't really been looked at seriously since 1981. And as you learned from the talks that came before mine, that there's just been an explosion of electronic data, an explosion of the need to have people who want to have that information and do good things with it. So rules aren't keeping up. And so what they're looking at doing is perhaps maybe creating better protections if they can. Of course, when people have rules and they get concerned about maybe interfering with their ability to conduct research, so they get worried about things like that happening. So there's going to be a lot of give and take that's going to challenge how the rule ends up. But what they would like to do is make changes that will improve transparency in the informed consent process. They'd like to generally require informed consent for secondary use of biospecimens. And this is very key because often we will have biospecimens that are left over from a procedure that people want to use for secondary purposes. And so there's a lot of conversation about how we can protect those individuals and the biospecimens themselves. Also looking at how to right size the review process that institutional review boards are required to do, putting perhaps less oversight on things that are less risky or harm to an individual subject, and more process into research that would be a little bit more sensitive. And then also too, which is really brings joy to me, is better harmonization with the HIPAA privacy rules. Right now we struggle with two different rules, and we try and figure out, well, when one applies. Really, HIPAA should universally be applied, but I think that there's some confusion among IRBs as to when and how it should be applied. So I'm happy to see that this is something that they're going to be doing. The published notice of public rulemaking was published in September of 2015. The comment period has closed already. I believe it closed on January 6, 2016. So we've had our opportunity to comment, and we'll just have to wait and see what the regulators end up with. Part of the harmonization that's being proposed is to start using some of the HIPAA definitions. So here I have the three major types of data sets, and defined as HIPAA would define them. We have data sets where there's no identifiers. So those are considered de-identified data sets. And HIPAA does not regulate them any further than once you've appropriately de-identified that data set. But that's not to say there's not a probability that you could re-identify a person, because it is possible, but there's a low probability of it happening, at least from HIPAA's regulatory perspective. Data sets with indirect identifiers are called limited data sets. Those are available for research purposes, and they don't require that we ask our patients to use their information. A limited data set does not require authorization. You can include dates in a limited data set. So with that, there's a moderate, based on HIPAA's perspective, a probability of re-identification. There's data sets which have direct identifiers, and those are the most concerning. And when we use those, sometimes it's necessary in research. It's not that they can't be used in research, but we have to take great care in how those are used, because they directly identify who that person is. De-identification standards, there's two methodologies that can be used. There's the expert determination methodology, and then there's the safe harbor. I think here at the institution, we primarily use safe harbor. And that's really basically stripping out the 18 different identifiers that HIPAA regulations have identified as being protected health information, and then using that in combination with that not having knowledge of the possibility or probability of re-identifying individuals in that data set. So with that, we say that if we have, depending on the data set, we consider what is the risk of re-identification. So it's always difficult to achieve the balance of protecting the privacy of the individuals who are subject of that information with the need to use that information. So this diagram is just trying to show that with each bit of information you have about a person, you really run the probability of re-identification increases. So you start with an anonymized data set. An anonymized data set is something that contains absolutely no identifiers in there, whether it is a date that would not be there, basically stripped all of anything that we could possibly think of as being an identifier. Then there is the de-identified, safe harbor, or of course the other methodology, all the way up to identifiability. So, but you think about that, and you're just thinking about these in singular data sets. We think, well, we've anonymized the data set, then we can't identify who it is. But when we talk about big data sets and we start linking these data sets, the probability of identifying individuals increases. And with that, there's been a couple of instances where people have shown that you can take anonymized data sets and actually re-identify individuals. So the first instance is there was an individual who used de-identified data that was released by an insurance group, and they combined that with voting lists, and they were able to identify that a former Massachusetts governor was part of that data set, and his name was William Weld. Quite famous, yes. And what that study did lead to is trying to improve the HIPAA regulations and the de-identification provisions and guidance. Also, there's the Netflix example, where we've had, there was a public data set of about 50,000 Netflix users who were, Netflix thought it was an anonymous database or de-identified database. It was about a bunch of ratings. And they released that data set, and there was an individual who was able to figure out who those individuals were. There's a paper on it. I can get you the link if you'd like to review that. But they identified users and uncovered potentially sensitive information about them. This resulted in, well, part of the fact that they were able to be re-identified did end up being part of a lawsuit. A class action lawsuit was filed against Netflix. And it was what it was that they said that Netflix violated the Federal Video Privacy Protection Act. And I got to get my statistics on what actually ended up happening there. So Netflix paid $9 million to resolve the class action privacy lawsuit, in addition to paying $6.5 million to 20 nonprofit institutions and $2.5 million to the lawyers. I think I picked the wrong job. But also, they required Netflix to stop linking former subscriber names with their movie viewing history. They, but it also, interestingly, and we do move slow a little bit in the law, but interestingly, there was an amendment that was approved for amending the privacy protection law. And that was, the law states that you can't disclose information about an individual without their consent. It was amended to require, not only just not disclose, but also to destroy it. But it was amended in 2013 to allow customers to give consent on an ongoing basis. The amendment now allows Netflix to integrate with Facebook by sharing users' movie selections with their social networking friends. So there's a lot of things that had to take place so that you guys could do that in your Facebook accounts. The other thing is, really, one of the other challenges is balancing privacy when we're talking about genomic data or DNA sequencing data, because our data is unique to individuals. So this was another instance where using a computer, the internet, and public data, this team of researchers were able to identify 50 individuals who had submitted personal genetic materials to as part of a research study. So they're able to identify those individuals. So, keeping in mind that DNA samples never can be truly anonymized. So we have to figure out, how do we work with these data sets? And a lot of it involves a trust model. A lot of it involves doing what we can to put policies and procedures in place. So there's a lot of things that come together, and it really takes a village for all of us to maintain privacy and security of our research subjects. But there's other laws. There's that govern genetics, and there's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is GINA. And basically that is, it protects the genetic privacy of the public by including research participants, and makes it illegal for health insurance or employers to request that information to be used in any other purpose which could cause them to any kind of harm or discriminate against them. And then there's also the NIH genomic data sharing policy, and there's a lot of data sets that the NIH has curated that they have strong policies in place for access and use of that data. HIPAA does not apply to genetic information, by the way, if there's no way to identify them by name or anything like that. The only thing that HIPAA says about genomic data is it can't be used in or shared with insurance companies. So I think there's still a lot that we can do to help protect subjects of research and individuals who want to participate in research and with their privacy. And this, I think, this is one of my last couple of slides here, but this, I think, is interesting. It's done by the Pew Research Center. It's a poll about Americans' attitudes about privacy, security, and surveillance. It was done in 2015, so it's fairly recent. I looked at another one that was done about 10 years ago, but it seems to be fairly consistent to what we are showing here. And I just point out a couple of things. The first is that there was 93% of adults who wanted to be in control about who had access to their information. We know that we use our patients' information for research. As researchers, we know that. Our patients, not so much. We tell our patients in their notice of privacy practice that we will use their information for healthcare, operational purposes, for treatment, and for billing purposes. We tell them that we'll use their information in research under two conditions. We say we'll use their information with their consent or under a waiver. I don't know if they really quite understand what all of that means in terms of their privacy. So we have a long way to go to educate our population of patients. And the other thing, too, is when you're talking about health information exchanges, a lot of our information, all of our patient information goes into a health information exchange. Mine goes into that health information exchange. Yours goes into the health information exchange. You can't stop for that going forward into those large databases. And then that could be further shared for other purposes. So with that, I ask you the question, do you know where your data is? So I'm not a statistician. You're talking about this particular one right here, right? This one? Well, how they managed to do it, I can't tell you. I couldn't even begin to tell you. But they were able to do that, and they used the internet. So they had to have had some information that was attached to that sample. So it didn't have to be something that identified me directly, but it was something that provided them enough information to make some guesses, and then, of course, statistically showing that they're able to actually directly identify the individuals. Well, they had information that they were able to use. It was not identifiable, but they were able to create the links to make it identifiable through their re-identification techniques.
All right, thank you very much. So now we're going to have Dr. David Hanauer, who is the Assistant Director of the Cancer Center Informatics Core, right? And an Associate Professor in Pediatrics, give his talk.
Okay. So this is a slightly different topic than the others. This is not really so much about EHRs, but more about some of the things that you can do with data from EHRs. I thought that might be a little bit more interesting to people in this audience just to understand the kind of things that you can do with the data. I can certainly talk about EHRs or usability with EHRs another time if you wanted to do that. So I thought I should just say, we collect a lot of data as part of routine care. That would be called the primary use of clinical data. When we use it for other purposes, that's called the secondary use of data. And really what I'm talking about here is all the secondary use of data, not for clinical care, but really for all those other things like research. And interestingly, about 25 years ago, someone had come up with what they called the first law of medical informatics, where they said that data shall be used only for the purpose for which they were collected. And we have obviously discarded that law because we use it for just about anything else that we can think of. Around the same time, someone else came up with some other laws where they said that data always will be used for purposes other than originally intended. And that's kind of really what we do around here. So what I thought I would do is just take you through a pathway of research that I had done at one point that I thought would be of interest to all of you. And it really started out with your group. When I say your group, I mean like I'm a clinical informatics person. I don't do omic stuff, but this originally started with someone who did. So this, so Dan Road, yes, a graduate from here, and a Rolchnai, and they had this paper about how they were doing what they called molecular concept mapping, and they were looking for associations among gene expression signatures. And it was kind of an interesting work that they were doing. And basically, they were looking at different genes that are expressed in gene signatures and doing some chi-square tests or Fisher's exact tests to look to see which genes were sort of being co-expressed together. And they came up with these very interesting network diagrams to show the relationships of things that were being co-expressed together. And I thought that was really fascinating. And we were talking at one point, and we said, well, instead of sort of the gene expressions expressing different genes, what if we actually just said, well, what if these were patients expressing diagnoses? Is it a similar kind of thing? And we actually just took their software, threw in some of our patient data to see what we would get. And so this is the paper that we had written based on that work. We basically took 1.5 million free text, sort of at the time was free text, diagnoses from our problem list from about 300,000 patients. We used a tool they had built and just put it in there just to see what we would get. And we basically did an association analysis, found almost 800,000 associations in this data set. And then we started exploring some of these manually. And of course, we can come up with our own interesting network diagrams if we sort of zoom in just to show you the kind of things that we found. And these are color-coded based on kind of disease types, just to show you that a lot of these things cluster together. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but we could find things that really kind of showed it works. So that green circle in the middle, non-insulin dependent diabetes, which is type 2 diabetes, we sort of said, well, what did it find that was associated with it? And really everything it found were things that we knew about. And that kind of gave us some confidence that this thing may really be working and doing something real. We found some things we didn't really know or couldn't explain, like shingles and hypothyroidism, but we could use these network diagrams to help us find out why those might be related. So when we looked at the network diagrams, we could see that, well, maybe it's because someone was being treated for cancer, and through chemotherapy, these things might be related because you can get your immune system suppressed through chemotherapy, et cetera, and be hypothyroid as well. We also found this very unusual one, cat bite and depression. Couldn't really figure out what that was about at all, but it was really interesting. I'll get back to that later. So there's, of course, limitations of this, right? You can find these associations, but there's no causation. We had no temporal information, so we didn't know what was happening first or second. So we thought, well, maybe we can explore this further. So then later on, I had another attempt where I was actually trying to look for maybe some temporal associations between things. And this was yet another paper, and you can share the slides and you can look up the papers if you want. But so what I used here was instead of these free text diagnoses, these are ICD codes. These are basically diagnosis codes we use for billing. Most institutions have these. They're used heavily for research. They weren't designed for research. They were designed for billing. They're often inaccurate. I think Julia had mentioned how lots of the stuff we have is inaccurate, but you sort of take what you can get. There's strange ICD codes, right? We've got ICD-10 codes for struck by chicken, injury due to legal intervention by explosives, accident involving spacecraft, burn due to water skis on fire. There are so many codes out there. I have no idea why or how they're there. Those are not the ones I focus on. So this is data from our own health system here. Oh, those are real code, yes. I don't know 1.6 million patients. We had about 41 million time-stamped ICD codes. We didn't actually have real data times. We just got relative times. This was really a de-identified data set. It was just codes, times, and just a non-patient identifier to link them together. And to show you kind of what we did here, we could basically take a single code, let's say chronic fatigue syndrome, and that's what this middle line is here. And then we could take other codes that were paired with it. So basically, if you look at this top line here, each dot represents a patient who had both an intracranial injury and the code for chronic fatigue syndrome. And then we could plot when they happened on a timeline. And you can see here that almost every single patient who had both intracranial injury and chronic fatigue syndrome, the intracranial injury happened before their diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. Whereas if they had dysphagia, almost every patient, and again, every dot is a patient who had both of those codes, it happened afterwards. So that really suggested some temporal thing going on between those codes. What's that? What is? Oh, dysphagia, sorry, basically difficulty, let's say, swallowing, sometimes speaking, but usually swallowing. And then voice and resonance disorder, you can see that this is sort of kind of on both sides. It suggests that there's basically no temporal relationship. It's sort of random between the two. That's kind of what we did there. And of course, we can come up with our diagrams here. This time with arrows basically showing sort of the passage of time, what came first and what came second. We could look at this at different time scales. The one that I circled here was one that was 10 years apart, basically just to show you that the first one was a pregnancy. The second one was a delivery, basically, but at 10 years apart, this is not the same pregnancy and delivery. So you can get things that have really no meaning at all, and you'll still get results, of course. You have to be careful with that. So back to the cat bites. In this data set here, we had about 800 animal bites. We had about 193 patients of the animal bites with depression. 24% of those with the bite had depression, compared to 6.7% of the general population. And the depression usually preceded the bite. So it was of interest, but again, didn't really know what to make of that. And of course, there were lots of challenges and open questions to this. The coding, as I mentioned, is often wrong. And the big question, which I think is still a huge open question, is how do you identify interesting or novel findings and filter out what's already known? And that's a really hard problem to do. And part of this is because there's no data set you can download of this is what we know in medicine, especially things that are already in a pre-coded format, right? You can get a textbook, but that's not the same as a nice clean data set that says, yes, we know these two diseases are related. But there is Medline, so maybe that could be a source of this kind of data. So this is this study here where we actually try to do that. Just to explain what we had here, we had our 1.6 million patients with 41 million codes from our own health system. We had 20.5 or 21 or so million abstracts from Medline or PubMed, which is the literature of biomedical literature. It was basically every single abstract ever published, right? You hope that there's a lot of information in there. So what did we do here? Basically, we took these abstracts, these citations, the full text of the abstract, not the full paper. We ran a natural language processing tool that some of you may be familiar with called MetaMap. We got UMLS codes, which are basically codes that can be, it's sort of like a standard coding system for biomedicine in general. We took that, mapped them back to ICD-9 code, which was basically the same language of our diagnoses codes. We ran chi-square tests on both of these, basically looking for what two diagnoses are mentioned in any single abstract, what two diagnoses appear for any single patient, to say, well, now we can compare them and see what we get. And the hope was that we would have our big volume of clinical data, these associations we found, and the hope was that if we overlap the ones that we found in the literature, in Medline, we would maybe have this little bit of sliver left of things that did not overlap, which would be these new interesting discoveries that we could find. So that was what we hoped for. The reality was sort of what you can see here in this diagram in the upper left-hand corner, which is that almost nothing overlapped at all. So instead of discovering lots of new things, we just basically had two different data sets that really didn't even overlap at all, and that was kind of sad. So I'll just get back to the cat thing right now for just a little bit, because that I thought was interesting. We actually did a paper about this, because I was really intrigued, like what could possibly be going on here? Is this real? And part of it was because the code for cat bite is a very non-specific code. There is, at least at the time, there was a code for dog bites, but not one specific to cat bites. So cat bites could have been any other kind of squirrels or other stuff. So we thought we should look into this a little bit more. So we went back to our data warehouse and pulled out 1.3 million patients, just adults. We found every single patient with depression based on an ICD code. And then we did a manual chart review. So we actually went through the clinical notes of these patients with cat bites and depression to figure out, like, did he really have a bite? Did they really have, was it a cat bite? Was it a dog bite or something else? So to really kind of just get to the point, what we found here was that the overall probability of depression in our patient population here at Michigan was 9%. 7% of all males had depression. 11% of all females had depression. If they had a dog bite, that really jumped up considerably. 21% of males and 36% of women had depression in the patients who had dog bites. And in cat bites, for the men, it was 24%, which is still pretty high, but not too much different. But for women, strangely, 47%. So basically, in our 1.3 million patients, among the people, women who came into our health systems to get cared for a cat bite, half of them had depression, either before or afterwards. And you know, this does kind of raise issues about this kind of crazy cat lady sort of stereotype. Of course, there are other people out there who will say, no, there's no such thing, like this person writing in the New York Times there. This guy here, he's a Czech researcher. He thinks your cat can make you crazy. And there's actually been lots of research that has at least linked this Toxoplasma gondii parasite to things like self-inflicted violence, prenatal depression, suicide rates in women, obsessive compulsive disorder, refractory depression until they treated this parasite. So there is some evidence there to suggest that maybe there could be something real going on. So the question, of course, really are cats these nice benign creatures that everybody has, or are they actually causing lots of problems in people? We don't really know. So this was a complicated journey where we started with these association analyses, dove into the data a little bit further, found this strange relationship between cats and depression. Don't know really what it's about, but you know, it's just of interest. So I thought that I would share that all with you, and that's all I had to say.
All right, so we've heard, as promised, a very wide field for this topic, from usage rates throughout the nation to the regulatory difficulties and things with EMRs, and also an example of their use. And so at this point, we open the floor to questions. Because these presentations were all very information dense, hopefully you've got a few questions to ask our panelists. And for as much as a half an hour, we'll be doing this. Since I've got the mic first, I'm going to go ahead and steal my opportunity here. Something I noticed in your presentation was that for the incentives for using these EMRs, one thing that was listed is that if you don't use them, you're legally liable. And 55% of people said that that would be, an incentive, but 45%, I guess, didn't. Now, do I understand correctly that legally liable means that they would be in violation of the law and therefore subject to prosecution?
So I think it really has to do with what the standard of care is. And so it's an interesting question of, as these systems get more adopted, does using them become the standard of care such that if you're not using them, you're actually, engaging in malpractice?
Right.
And so that's, I think that's something that's evolved over time. We are not at the point now where people who don't use electronic health records are getting sued for malpractice, but there are certain, you can probably speak to this too, right? There are certainly cases in which, whether or not things go right, and in some cases go wrong in electronic health records, are leading to new types of malpractice. So it's an active area of intersection.
Okay. Well, and I guess that's where I was leading it. It just kind of struck me as surprising that 45% of doctors said, yeah, I'll go ahead and just malpractice if this is the law, because I don't want to deal with EMRs. And I guess that where I was going with that is for you, given that you're the director of regulatory compliance, is this an accurate window into how doctors generally will view legal liability? And say, well, if it makes my job too difficult, okay, fine. I was kind of shocked by that finding, was all.
Well, I think you need to consider too that sometimes the electronic medical record incorporates a lot of information, and you have to again look at standard of care and see whether that physician practices standard of care. There's a wealth of information in there, but some of it is not accurate. Some of it might be pulled in from a patient that's not even the patient that has that condition. So there's a lot of legal, I think, contemplation we have to put to this, because it's almost unfair to say that because you have not scanned every single record in the patient's record that you could be found to be malpractice. So there's a lot more conversation that takes place.
The question that I have is about permissions granularity. One of the things that's going on right now in the world of smartphones is that almost every app that you install has some permissions. And at least at the beginning of both Android and iOS, they were very messed up. There was a permission called telephone that covered everything from getting access to your telephone number to actually making calls directly without your permission. And so just recently, updates for both of those operating systems uh, have been tearing the permissions down into smaller pieces, partly as a way of addressing a consumer backlash against apps that ask for every permission under the sun. And is that kind of thinking going on in the EMR space in terms of making more granular the access that researchers and even medical providers might have to these records? Is that is that kind of thinking applicable to this? Would it be useful in increasing anonymity for research purposes? How much would it inhibit research? Broadly, how applicable is this?
Well, we try to, well, we have to, under HIPAA law, to use only what we minimally need to accomplish our research objective. And so we have to use that as our principal guidance whenever we ask for or request information. We have robust IRB processes that are in place that will review the project, and they'll review whether there's going to be harm to subjects based on information or whatever that's going to be the end result of research. So, or the participation in the research. So, is it perfect? No, we have a long way to go. And the trouble that or the challenges that we face is that the research community wants more information. They want more granularity in the research data. And so we have to try to always balance that with trying to make sure that research can go forward, but putting in as many protections as we can, both from a legal perspective and from a policy perspective.
And I think, I mean, I feel that, informed consent is an area in which it's been, the path forward has been very murky. And I think there are people who argue what we need to move for is a highly granular, making decisions about who can access each piece of our data. And personally, I just don't think it's feasible. Like, it's just a non-starter to me. So then you think about, okay, well, what does the other end look like? Could you articulate a set of principles for which you would like some kind of algorithm to operationalize those principles for you? And ideally after you die as well, right? Because then how do we manage consent once patients are no longer living, but their data continues to live on? So I think it's very unclear, and there are people who are arguing for a lot of different approaches to consent. And I think it's we are going to learn a lot from what we're doing outside of healthcare. But I think the reality is we really don't know how to do this well yet.
Correct, and part of the changes that are going to be made to the common rule is going to address trying to put more transparency in the consent process, making sure that people understand what their information is going to be used, how that information is going to be used, and the best that we can do is to educate it as much as we can. The part that I think is a little bit more challenging is when we use the information without their authorization. They have no idea that the information is being used, and that's more challenging. And so there's a lot of rigor that we try to put around research projects like that, where we make sure that there's the appropriate security measures that are in place as best as we can, and that there's a lot of understanding by the research team about what it is that they're working with. There's sensitivity training, HIPAA compliance training that goes into their understanding. And so we try to put all of these administrative measures in place, because we always, above all, want to be respectful for the information in which we use it.
So my question is for Julia, but I want to make a comment first and just follow on what you said. There are people here at Michigan and elsewhere that are actually looking into computable models of consent to automate that process, and of course also looking at patterns of behavior and desires of large populations of people with regard to the application of some of those models. My question is actually about the health information exchanges and meaningful use. So my question is that in previous research published a few years back, there's a lot of evidence that even when health information is available in electronic health information exchange, it's not being used to impact care. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Is meaningful use been effective in that regard, or are we simply putting lots of information in a health information exchange and not actually impacting care with it?
Sure. I think that the answer today is still largely no, that even when that information we've sort of solved the information sharing problem, it's still not getting to the point of care, to the point of clinical decision. And I think that that has a lot to do with clunky technology and poor workflows. And I think there are cases in which we're getting this right. So for people who practice here in our healthcare system, they've probably seen that now Epic has Care Everywhere, which really is sort of the most seamless that's out there. And it's still not great, but it at least sort of is as accessible as sort of any other piece of data in the record. And so I pulled data from our health system to study, does it seem to be impacting ED care? And what you find is that when information's coming back through Care Everywhere, there's a lower likelihood that the patient's admitted, they're getting out of the ED quicker. So I think when done well, we're starting to see that the information is used and is impacting care, but it's unfortunately the minority of cases where I think we've really built these exchanges in ways that make it easy for the providers to use and access information. And if not, they're just too busy, frankly, to take the time to go search out this information.
I would like to correct myself. So I looked it up what my question was earlier. So they did identify 50 individuals without having a sample. There wasn't a spit sample to compare with. What they did is they went through some Y chromosomal database, found last names with that, and had enough non-identifiable so-called information about them to find the location, the birth. They knew the age, I guess. And so after that, age and last name of whatever that. So even if they weren't in a Y chromosomal database, someone else with that last name was, and that's how they were linked. Because I couldn't figure out from what you're saying, there had to be something, and the something is the Y chromosome and the last name from someone else. But to make it, so it is a bit scary. But on the other hand, one of my questions is in the genetic counseling and genetic testing ethics community, there are some really good papers that show that all these scare things, in the end, very, very little harm has been done to any particular individual, but because of participating in genetic studies or because of some leaks. So are these 50 people actually harmed by someone knowing it, or was this particular participant in a, let's say, stigmatizing database, like a bipolar database, and he might not want everyone to know that he's suffering from bipolar disorder? Or how good is the evidence that there were actually, with all these leaks and things that have or could have happened, that actual damage was done?
So I think harm is something that we have to consider, and you hit the nail on the head when you talk about the sensitivity of the data, the sensitivity of the diagnosis. So part of what we do when we're looking at whether there's a potential for harm from the IRB's perspective in studies going forward is we look at those pieces and make determinations of how the data should be protected and whether informed consent would be necessary before they even went forth with the research project. So there's a lot of things that come into play with the data, and sensitivity is certainly an important factor, and also rare conditions too. So someone might have a rare condition. It may not be sensitive necessarily, but because of the rarity of that condition, we can identify who those individuals are. I think it remains to be seen from larger databases of what the harm can be. Certainly the harm would be to your information being used inappropriately, harm to you financially if they're using it to purchase things out on the marketplace, so that you're dealing with credit card companies and so on and so forth. So there's the financial harm, there's the reputational harm which you bring forward. It could be very embarrassing for somebody to have information let out that perhaps maybe I have gone through substance abuse treatment. I wouldn't want my colleagues to know that. I'm making this up, but there's things that are very sensitive to people that we have to be always vigilant in making sure that information is kept as private as we possibly can. And a lot of that is within a trust model. And so those are things that are outside of policy and regulatory control. We have to trust people in which they're given access to that information to treat it properly.
There's also, I think, the psychological harm of knowing your information is out there. I mean, that's, I think, increasingly what we're seeing. That last slide you showed that people want control of their data, and therefore, when they know that it is then out of their control, that there is this psychological harm, and and that's, I think, a real thing, even though it doesn't often feel like real harm.
there has been cases that have gone to court systems, and the people have to show harm. So you have to show that you've been harmed, whether it's a financial harm or otherwise. So I think in the court systems, you're going to have to do that in order to recover any sort of monies to become what you would consider yourself to be whole financially or even emotionally whole through the court system. So you might be part of a suit, but so far what I have heard is most of them have been tossed out because the people have not been able to show that they've been harmed. But that's not to say that it couldn't happen.
I'm interested in the secondary use of biospecimens, and I was wondering if there's a sense of how, like with the new changes to the common rule, if all biospecimens are going to be treated equally, like would a microbiological specimen be treated with the same protections as a tissue specimen where maybe the risk to the patient is greater?
Well, I don't know to that granularity, but I do know that there's a lot of conversation that would be improving the informed consent process when it is a biospecimen involved, so that the people that's their specimen, that they will be able to actually give informed consent rather than it being a waiver of consent/authorization. So I don't know, to answer your question directly, perhaps you know the difference between those types of samples, but for biospecimen that's collected, we want to make sure that we get informed consent. Now, informed consent could mean that we consent for future research, unspecified future research. So you can consent to the research project that is at hand, and then to future research for that use of that sample. And the common rule is targeting both of those areas for informed consent.
David, so fun little examples there. So I guess I'm sort of following on your example. So, fantastic opportunity to find false discoveries by mining the data here. So what safeguards are in place on methods of validating what you can find? And I mean, the literature, biomedical literature is riddled with false, irreproducible results. And so how are we going to move forward to make sure it's real?
I think it's an open question. I think the problem is that all we have are just the data that we have, and I think all we can do is really just say we have found this, and then other people may have to take it on and do more, right? So a prospective trial if somebody wants to. Of course, some things may not be important enough to bother with, but I don't think we know. I mean, when we did even that work with the MetaMap tool and we looked at Medline, there's typographic errors that it'll find mistakes. It'll find diseases that don't exist because of a typographic error or misinterpretations of how these automated tools work. And there is no good way. I mean, I sort of got stuck. I stopped going down that line because I couldn't find any good automated way to filter out the real from the non-real. The thing I'm going to try next is a crowdsourcing thing. So I've got a Europe student I'm going to be working with where we're going to try to put some of this stuff online and let people look up pairs of associations and figure out do they think it's real or it's not. Probably more for clinicians. And this is partly because I still read papers all the time where someone's come up with some new association that makes the news. We go back to our data set, it's there. So we thought that this might be useful just to have out there so people can sort of look up and annotate on their own. I think you need some clinical judgment, basically. You need someone who actually understands to say that I know this disease domain and I know that this is strange or unusual versus, oh no, we've known that for a long time. It may not be in the textbook, but this is well known. I don't know if I answered your question or not. But yeah. Yeah.
There's also bleeding into treatment decisions, right? I mean, I think that you just talked about associations between diseases, but increasingly now we're using these data sets to look at, what do we know about when treatment A versus treatment B has been applied, and the sort of green button paper. And so, I mean, I think it even goes beyond understanding two diseases, but also now into informing treatment decisions, which is perhaps both exciting and scary.
So first I want to thank all three of you. I think it's been a pretty interesting afternoon, and I especially like this model where the students figure out a topic, invite the speakers, and get educated about an area that's a little different from our usual seminar topics.
and socially important. A couple observations. First of all, on the original legislation, 2009 era of legislation, I am still aggrieved that people who knew better failed to take the opportunity to require at least significant progress toward interoperability. It was left out completely. They just shoveled out $19 billion of taxpayers' monies to make the worst possible combination of incompatible systems permanent. And it's getting worse instead of better, as far as I can tell. Nearly every company operates on the model that if they can sell you the system, they own you. And after that, it's your problem. And all the special systems you need for ophthalmology or for longitudinal data or other stuff that doesn't fit in the system you just paid a few $100 million to install, good luck. And of course, when you need upgrades, the problem compounds. This is highly unacceptable and regrettable. On the other side, I think people have become very much more comfortable using technology and computers and smartphones and all. And it is astonishing to me how many people are eager to put their data out there. You look to a site like Patients Like Me, there's a lot of mineable information. And some very interesting associations have been found, and there's opportunity for follow-up. People volunteer to share their private information, their psychological, and all kinds of information. Now, this is not saying everybody shares this attitude, of course not, but far more, I would say, than most of us expected. Finally, I have another grievance, which is about the attitude toward research in our society. And it's reflected severely in HIPAA legislation. It's also reflected in our own legal colleagues here and around the country in academic medical centers. It turns out that all this data, all these data that are so tightly protected, and if there should be an accidental release, trigger potential fines of enormous amounts, can be plowed for as much as you like, as long as you call it anything but research. If it's for patient care, covering most anything. If it's for billing, the most important use of all. Or if it's for safety investigation, quality of care. It's all permitted under exceptions. So long as you don't learn anything from it or share what you've learned. If you share what you've learned in the form of a publication, you've now committed a crime. And retroactively, what was a quality investigation or a safety investigation is reclassified as research because, after all, it's only those researchers who do things like publish in journals and help to educate their colleagues and the public. Are you as concerned about this as I seem to be?
We probably disagree. Yeah.
It is possible to make it worse than they have to be. My interpretation of what's happened with the HIPAA situation is that we've done a workaround. We've learned to get waivers for relatively expeditious approvals from our overburdened IRBs so that we can actually do some of these studies. But the activation energy for that is such that most people don't bother. There's a lot of unanalyzed data here and everywhere. And the lawyers, who typically can be described in one of two camps, those who tell you how to get things done, and those who tell you don't dare do anything, are mostly in the second camp, because the fear of litigation is greatest among institutional lawyers.
I think another way of saying that is the risk of not doing research, of being too scared of all of this stuff, and that, I think, is the way I would put it. I completely agree, and nobody in the ethics and legal community seems to think that not doing things that could help a lot of people is in any way an ethical violation. There's always the, okay, if there's a risk, then
Yeah.
Well, my only comment to your grievances would be that I think that what the legal community would say is that we're looking to make sure that the rules are followed. Research is something that we promote at University of Michigan and of course at other academic institutions as well. And we want to be able to collaborate with other institutions. It's just there's a legal way to do it that will keep us out of murky waters. And that's, I think, really all that we would, from a compliance perspective and from a legal perspective, like to see happen. I see from my job working with different researchers and on different projects, the data accessibility is wide here. We have a large risk appetite. And so what we just try to do is balance that risk appetite with trying to put in guardrails to keep researchers out of trouble and to keep the institution out of trouble.
I would say that I agree with your statement, especially when you talked about the IRB. I love the people in the IRB. They're very nice, but I do think that my personal experience is that people like me, we gum up the IRB with all these retrospective studies where we never interact with patients. We're really the only harm. The harm is always the same. The harm is the data could be lost somehow or stolen. But these they have to get reviewed. They ask very nitpicky questions. It takes months for them to be approved. And really, my view is that those should really be fast tracked. Worry about the integrity, the protection of the data, but fast track those and really focus on those trials where harm could actually happen to somebody. But right now they're almost treated equally, and they go through these very long processes.
Yeah, that I understand that perspective, and I think that part of the rule changes for the common rule is to look at those types of studies to say which ones are really high risk and put more process there, and ones that are lower risk, less process. So those things are being looked at from a regulatory perspective today.
Thanks. So I was just going to ask a question based on what you answered about the research risk. So most of your suggestions or your comments are focusing on the research within the institute. But I would say from a perspective, let's say a layman researcher or like some people that are starting doing the things, and it's very frustrating when you say when you want to find data to learn, say the people's purchase preference or those things. It's very easy to get those data from, let's say, Kaggle or a lot of online data sets. And when people are starting to get into, let's say, medical research or there's health related information, and we're starting facing all kinds of regulation and all kinds of barriers. And so in that case, isn't that the regulation to some extent is like hindering the studying in this area? And also when talking to other people, when people starting thinking about big data, one of the problems coming out is like every time when we discuss about this topic, we thought, we go onto YouTube and click 2 episodes of Daily Show and starting pumping out all Donald Trump stupid talk. And when we really get to medical study and they think, okay, people studying these data and cancer still not cured and my disease still not helpful for my disease. So is it giving a bad impression about this area? And is there any like policy coming on like to address this issue? Thanks.
So we have to be reminded that the information that we are using from the medical record is personal and private to that patient. And so we have to be respectful for the regulations that try to balance research with the privacy of an individual. And HIPAA, I don't see as changing the way it's written anytime in the future. So we have to try to figure out how do we best apply the rules and work within the rules. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or your concern, but understanding that the data that we're working with is very private to people, and we have to be respectful of that.
My question is, why can't you just have a simple program that takes out of a big data set, just takes out the, the identifiers like the name and things like that, and then you'd have the data without the, the identifiers. And I mean, it'd be a pretty simple program, I think. Is anybody else here a programmer?
I can address that to some degree. So I would say there's two kinds of data sets. One would be unstructured data, where
Right.
everything is already, or one is the structured data where everything is already clearly defined in columns. And that you can do a pretty reasonable job of removing the identifiers because they're in easily removable columns. Remove the name column, remove the address column, and you can give more or less clinical data. I think that the truth is that a lot of that structured data is only a small part of the actual picture of a patient. Most of the data, in my opinion, is in the free text, unstructured clinical notes that clinicians make.
Well, you could even have a program that removes some of that. You
So
really
the
could.
answer is yes, you can, and I've actually
Right.
worked on some of that,
Okay.
and they work pretty well, but they always make mistakes because that's really a natural language processing program, and no NLP is ever perfect. And the question, of course, is really how much can you allow to pass through before you can really make it available to just about anybody. It's sort of really reduced identification as opposed to de-identification. And there's always going to be things in there that aren't really the clear identifiers, right? So you can have name, you can have dates, and remove all that. But if it says head coach of the U of M football team, you'll know who that person is. And things like that.
You mean like for career or whatever? Or,
it's almost infinite how you can describe something and identify who somebody is. So that's the problem, is that the software is out there. We haven't implemented it here. We probably should, just to help reduce the risk of releasing this kind of information.
I think it makes a big difference.
But things will still slip through.
The way I heard the question, it's why can't we just remove coded data identifiers, and wouldn't that be sufficient? And why is that such a problem? And I think even using coded identifiers, there's been plenty of work by LaTanya Sweeney, Brad Malin, and others on taking discrete data that's fully coded and linking it with publicly available data sets and re-identifying the actual data. So the problem is that the statistical distributions of the actual data elements can essentially, when you multiply them, to the probability of them together, you wind up with very small probability that it's anyone other than particular people. And that's the real risk. It has really little to do with the actual identification of what you remove. The problem still becomes a statistical distribution issue.
So I think that this might have been one of the most engaged question and answer sessions throughout this series that we do. So I want to thank you all for your questions. And of course, one more time, thank our speakers who have done a great job today.